In August 2015, Joanna and I, Ralph Hollingshead, made a pilgrimage to her ancestral homeland, Ukraine. We flew into the capital city, Kiev, and met our guide, interpreter, chauffeur, Andrei Dorosh of West Ukraine Tours, and then drove 550 kilometers to southwestern Ukraine, the region where Joanna's grandparents were living when they immigrated to Canada in the year 1900.
Hi, my name is Joanna Hollingshead, and we are in the Ukraine. It is so exciting and wonderful to be here.
As we traveled, everything about the countryside fascinated us. Ukraine is an agricultural nation, historically called the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. Coming from the Nevada desert, just seeing all that green was a novelty to us. Ukraine is a poor country for the most part, but this home obviously belongs to someone in the upper income brackets. Our base of operations in southwestern Ukraine was the city of Ridkivtsi, the regional capital, which sits astride the river Prut.
To reach the farming village where my grandparents made their home, we drove out of the city up into the countryside. Note the car in which we are riding. Andre reassured us when we booked the tour that I drive nice cars, and we agreed it was much better than many we saw on the roads and streets. The typical Ukrainian rides the bus. Not many own cars. Welcome to Ridkivtsi. Some of the more wealthy people in Chernovitz have homes outside the city in the villages. One of our goals while visiting Ridkivtsi was to find the home where my grandparents lived before they immigrated to Canada. We had the house number from the Orthodox Church records, but we learned that those house numbers date from the Austro-Hungarian Empire era. The Soviets introduced a different naming and numbering system when they took over. No one remembers the old numbering system, so we could not locate house number 695. We are a century and a half too late in trying to locate the house, as they have been destroyed or moved.
The predominant religion in Ukraine is Eastern Orthodox. For the past several years, Joanna and I have been studying the birth, marriage, and death records from this church, kept by the Orthodox priests in Ridkivtsi from 1840 to 1935, extracting information about the villagers named Balan, Grigororschuk, Maximus, Mararis, Presikar, and Pahalski, along with certain families with which they intermarried. It was a thrill to see the place where the information originated. The Ridkivtsi town hall, where we went to learn whether people with the last name mentioned above still live in the village, they called a man named Grigory Balan, who came to meet us at the town hall. He was cordial and complimented us for traveling so far to visit our ancestral homeland. He suggested we go visit a man renowned as a local historian. Grigory showed us the way to the man's home.
But first, in order to get our car out of the town hall parking lot, we had to ask a local farmer to move his fancy equipment. While we interviewed the historian, we snapped this picture of the rug in his parlor. He pointed out that the old province of Bukovina covered territory that today is mostly in Romania. Indeed, Ridkivtsi is only 45 kilometers from the Romanian border. Of the 6 surnames mentioned above, 4 are Romanian, such as Balan, Maximus, Moras, and Presikar.
Really? Is that
One
what
is Polish, Paholski, and the remaining one is true Ukrainian, Gregorashchuk. The peculiar thing about that revelation is that Joanna's family spoke Ukrainian in their home as she was growing up. We asked about Sloboda Varancha, one of the place names we found in the Ridkivtsi Orthodox Church records. The historian told us it was a small collection of farmhouses surrounded by fields to the east of Ridkivtsi, but that the Soviets had forced those families to resettle in the larger villages when the farms were collectivized in the 1940s. He appreciated the fact that we could show him the records of one of his great-grandmothers, Helena Balan, but he summed up his view of the history of the region by saying, "To modern-day Ukrainians, the past is not so important as the present and future."
Disassembled, put on the truck, taken to the museum, and assembled there. So you will be able to see number one. And that museum also has the church from Slobodara Ranch, a wooden church, a real church, which was...
Man, is it quite a big museum?
It's not the museum, indoor museum, it's the outdoor museum. You walk around and you see the houses where your family lived.
In Chernivtsi.
In Chernivtsi.
The historian then went with us through the village to show us where a family named Mororas lives. Interestingly enough, they pronounce their name Mororash. This is the home and farm of Dmitri and Fanaka Mororash. We found their grandchildren playing out front of their gate. Fanaka showed us her wood-burning oven where she would be preparing bread for the upcoming festival of the village patron saint. She said if we would return in 2 days, she would like to share some bread with us. Our hosts were pleased to tell us that they produce everything they need, growing their own wheat, grinding it into flour, and making their own bread. They also have a large garden, grapes, beehives, and animals. Dmitri has a small combine he uses to harvest wheat on his own land and on other farms in the region.
My new friend appreciated that we would come such a long distance to learn about the country. She told us she was from Boyan, a nearby village where my grandmother Parachiva Maximus was from. We determined to visit it as well this week. We went to the Ridkivtsi cemetery in hopes of finding more about my relatives. This beautiful floral display honors a Ridkivtsi man who recently died fighting the Russian invaders on the eastern border of Ukraine.
We had hoped to find Joanna's Aunt Domnica, who died as a 4-year-old child before the family emigrated to Canada. We found the cemetery was not well groomed. Lots of tall weeds and undergrowth. We should have realized and not been disappointed to learn that the cemetery had no registry of graves. In fact, in the 1800s, grave markers and coffins were made of wood and have long since decomposed. Further, it is common practice to reuse burial plots after a certain number of years when the above-ground mound has sunk down. Our hopes of finding Domka's grave were dashed. More recent graves had headstones that reflected surnames found on Joanna's pedigree, in this case, Mororas. These women's headstones show their married names were Morarish and Lupul. Maria and Sanda were most likely sisters, because below both their names is the patronymic daughter of Vasily. Here we found a Paholski couple, written in Cyrillic characters, of course, Theodore and Domka. Her patronymic is Daughter of Dmitri.
Times were tough during and immediately after World War II. Grave markers were not wood, but they weren't stone either. Ukrainian people whose records we have researched rarely live as long as this individual from 1894 to 1980. This man was evidently a very successful beekeeper. This is the road leading out of Ridkivtsi, looking toward Ridkivtsi on the horizon. Land is measured in hectares. This view shows how the rich farmland is divided into fields for growing a variety of crops. Our guide was told of a nice resort in the countryside where we might enjoy having lunch, so we drove that direction.
It turned out they had a small zoo. We hadn't expected to see an emu on this trip, nor a goldfish pond. The dirty little secret was that the resort was owned by the son of the former president of Ukraine, who enriched himself and his friends on the backs of the people. He was the pro-Russian politician overthrown in the 2014 revolution after having his troops fire on the protesters, killing 104 civilians. 2 days later, we headed back to Ridkivtsi, as promised, to the Mararasas. Fanaka had been up all night baking bread for the next day's festival. There were poppy seed loaves and huge kolache.
I learned to love her instantly. It was a wonderful feeling to be so welcomed. Before we left, she ran to her garden and got some seeds and told us to plant them in our yard next spring so we would have a living souvenir of our visit. And it was the marigold seeds.
Dmitri was ready for us this time, shirt and all.
Yeah.
The Mararasas sent us back to our hotel with a broad sampling of their homegrown products: watermelon, bread, honey, bottled pork, and cucumbers. We borrowed a big knife from the hotel kitchen. An important aspect of the economy is the cottage industries, which produce items for sale in the open markets and along the roadsides. These are floral displays for decoration of homes and graves. Every town has a church. Religion was suppressed during the communist era, so the people flocked back to church once they became independent. An interesting tidbit we learned from Andrei was that when part of the Soviet Union, the country was known as the Ukraine. But now, as an independent nation, they prefer simply Ukraine. He noted, "You wouldn't say the England or the Germany, so don't say the Ukraine." The Ukrainian flag has two rectangular fields, blue above and yellow below. Blue is symbolic of the sky, and yellow of the mature wheat fields, ready to harvest. Whether the crop in this picture in the distance is wheat is not the point.
A monument to the glory of agriculture, probably of Soviet-era vintage.
The communists wanted all the people to realize they were protected by the regime, so they placed monuments to their military power in cities and towns throughout the Soviet Union, with the barrels pointed west toward the evil NATO enemy. Sharing the road.
The little old lady who sold us some apples on the side of the road said, "I'm too old now to get up and pick the apples in my tree. So I pick up the apples that fall on the ground. And of course, they were all bruised. But we bought them from her, and she was delighted.
Life outside the cities in Ukraine is comparable to life in rural America in the 1930s.
Many people are dying there, still fighting for their independence in Ukraine. It was a very huge learning lesson to us, which I want to respect forever. I am very grateful for my heritage.